Any franchise that survives long enough is sure to stumble at some point. There's no better example of this than Sonic the Hedgehog. Sonic is one of gaming's longest running franchises, and during that time, Sega has produced some stellar Sonic games, as well as a few real stinkers. Much of the fan base, myself included, sees Sonic Adventure 2 as the high point of the series, at least among the 3D outings. Ever since, it's felt like Sega has tried to recapture lightning in a bottle like they had with Sonic Adventure 2, to varying degrees of success. It makes sense then that vocal fans have been asking for a Sonic Adventure 3 for a long time now. Well, it turns out that solo developer Felipe Ribeiro Daniluz got sick of waiting and just went and made it himself. Spark the Electric Jester 3 for Nintendo Switch is Sonic Adventure 3 in every sense but name. Not only is it everything fans have been waiting for, but it's also the best Sonic game in years. I don't want to do a disservice to what Daniluz has created here by referring to Spark as just a Sonic game instead of his own Electric Jester creation, but for context, this series began as a Sonic fan game, and he has since developed the Electric Jester franchise off that core Sonic DNA, and this game wears its inspiration proudly. Spark the Electric Jester 3 is obviously the third game in the series, but you don't need to have played the others to dive in here. There's a story, and it gets much darker and more meta than your typical Sonic tale, but it's not necessary to enjoy the gameplay. The gameplay is pure 3D Sonic. You have a boost, a homing attack, a rail grind, loop-de-loops, robot enemies, and speed beyond belief. If you've ever played a 3D Sonic game, Spark plays nearly identically, except better, like way better, in nearly every conceivable way. I am in awe of what Daniluz has created here. It feels like he has fixed nearly every flaw in 3D Sonic's design and made the perfect Sonic game. Let's start with the controls. Spark is more responsive than any of Sonic's recent outings. In games like Sonic Colors, Sonic Forces, and Sonic Generations, there are points when you're going really fast that the game seems to be playing itself. And if you try to wrestle control back, Sonic will refuse your input or behave in some unintended way, throwing you off track to a quick death. Not so with Spark. Even if you're flying through the stage at warp speed, if you want to stop, turn around, and grab a collectible, turning on a dime is easy peasy. You're always in control with Spark, and it makes the overall game feel less like a series of impressive set pieces and more like an idealized version of what 3D Sonic could and should be. I went back and played some of those 3D Sonic games for comparison, and Spark really does blow them out of the water. It's not just the controls that are a marked improvement either, it's also the level design. Most Sonic levels are linear corridors with specific places for player input, broken up by stretches of fancy scenery where your only job as the player is to hold the joystick forward. In contrast, the levels in Spark are enormous open spaces with choices for routes at every moment, with secret areas and explorable sections galore. Most levels also have multiple awards you can obtain by completing different objectives, such as finding all 10 secret medals or completing the stage in a certain time limit. This makes replaying each stage worthwhile, since beating the stage as fast as possible plays very differently than scouring every area for those secret medals. And given that there's so many routes, you'll want to replay every stage since there's this constant feeling of missing out on something if I had only gone the other way. It's a brilliant addition to the 3D Sonic level formula, and it makes every linear Sonic stage feel absolutely archaic in comparison. On top of that, there are also various vehicles you'll control, and they're all great. The flying shooter sequences in particular are a lot of fun. They reminded me of the Tails levels from Sonic Adventure 2, but again, just done better. This isn't a short game either. On top of the normal stages, there are also smaller, more focused stages, each elaborating on some core concept, like rail grinding, speed, vehicles, or combat. But that's not all. Once you've beaten the main game, you'll unlock every single level from Spark the Electric Jester 2. That's an entire extra game's worth of content, and it's excellent. None of these bonus levels have any rails to grind, but otherwise they're just as good as the main story campaign, and in some ways even better because they have far less combat. Okay, so I've avoided talking about the combat up to this point because it's easily the weakest element of the package. It's not bad, it just doesn't match the quality of the rest of the game. Most enemies for the first half of the game die from a simple homing attack, but around halfway through, we start seeing enemies that need to be defeated using hand-to-hand combat. There are a few different combos and an effective dodge roll, but it's pretty simple stuff. The problem is that combat just slows down the flow of the game. You'll be speeding through loops, rail grinding at top speeds, and then come to an invisible wall where you'll have to defeat a certain number of enemies to progress. These sections just kill the pacing, and I rolled my eyes every time I entered one of these areas. Thankfully, there's not that many of them. My advice is to set the combat difficulty to the easiest setting so you can just blast through these enemies as quickly as possible and get back to the rest of the game. Don't get me wrong, there's nothing broken here, it all works fine, it plays well enough, and it's much better than something like the Werehog levels in Sonic Unleashed, but it just doesn't add anything to what is otherwise a nearly perfect package. It's unnecessary, kills the pacing, and in my opinion, the whole game would have just felt much tighter if the combat had been left on the cutting room floor. There's a progression system as well, where you can unlock different combos and additional moves for Spark. At first glance, it seems really fleshed out, but it doesn't really amount to much at the end of the day. Thankfully, it doesn't take very long to unlock all the additional moves, so while I like the concept of unlockables in a game like this, it's underutilized here. But here's the thing you need to keep in mind while playing this game. Spark the Electric Jester 3 was essentially made by one person. I've played solo dev projects before, but no other solo developed game has blown my mind as much as this one. Sonic Team has the backing of millions of Sega dollars, as well as over 400 employees. Felipe Ribeiro Daniluz is one dude from Brazil, and he made a game that not only competes with, but trounces many of Sonic Team's official Sonic games. It's truly unbelievable what Daniluz has accomplished here, showing up an industry veteran developer and delivering what fans of the franchise have been pleading with Sonic Team for what feels like an eternity. This is a game made for fans, addressing fan desires and fan concerns, and delivering what Sonic fans could only dream of from official channels. Another thing I find baffling about this release is how little fanfare it is received from the press. I get that maybe Daniluz doesn't have an enormous marketing budget, but this is the most hidden gem of all hidden gems. I would have thought that every major outlet would have leapt at the chance to talk about this game. A solo developer taking on an enormous project, surpassing every expectation, and delivering what a dedicated community of gamers has wanted for a very long time. This attitude of taking things into your own hands, pushing the genre, and providing genuine competition to an occasionally stale franchise is something worth celebrating. I hope Sonic Team takes notice of how much this game does right, because this is absolutely the right direction for future entries in the Sonic franchise. Hell, even hire Daniluz to lead one of your teams. But even if they don't, it doesn't really matter. I just hope that Spark 3 does well enough that Daniluz will continue to expand on his formula in a sequel. Despite the lackluster combat, everything about this package is exceptional. It's the game Sonic fans have been dreaming of, and I highly recommend it. I'm gonna give Spark the Electric Jester 3 on Nintendo Switch a 9.4 out of 10. Thanks so much for watching, and if you liked this video, it would mean a lot if you liked and subscribed. See you next week.